I heard a call, a voice so true. Down by the river where the waters move. Gathering of freed families in Arkansas. In 1885, small yet determined communities of freed black families called Arkansas home, having survived the nightmare of slavery. These men and women, living in counties near Pine Bluff and Helena, constructed wooden cabins with their own hands, planted sweet potatoes, corn, and cotton, and organized schools within abandoned churches. They held onto the belief that, even though 2 decades had passed since the Civil War ended, their freedom could finally provide a chance to live with dignity. As sunrise touched the soil, fathers worked the land, while mothers tended vegetable gardens and taught their children the alphabet using broken slates and chalk. A strong community spirit thrived, with Saturday gatherings filled with prayer, music, and hopes for a future that no one could ever take away. Yet freedom, during this era, was fragile. Armed white patrols frequently passed near their land, and whispers of violence traveled from one county to the next. The families clung tightly to one another, fully aware that their unity was their sole defense. In that moment, the community stood at a crossroads, caught between hope and danger, unaware that their lives were about to be shattered once more by emerging threats from white landowners. While freed families dreamed of independence, numerous white landowners in Arkansas were equally determined to restore the old order. Former Confederates and plantation owners, who had once commanded enslaved labor, now faced fields without the free workforce they had depended on for generations. With each passing season, their resentment grew as they watched black farmers purchase small plots of land and sell their crops in town markets. By 1885, groups of angry whites began holding secret meetings, plotting ways to reclaim control. They spread rumors that freed men were either dangerous or lazy, poisoning public opinion to justify their violence. Sharecropping contracts were already designed to trap black families in endless cycles of debt, yet even that was insufficient for the most ruthless landowners. They desired complete domination, the same forced labor that had made their fathers wealthy before the war. Some organized bands of riders dressed in plain clothes, patrolling the countryside to intimidate and threaten anyone who dared to resist. Freed families recognized the danger but could not imagine the scale of the betrayal that was coming. The air in Arkansas grew heavy with tension as two visions of the South, freedom and slavery, collided once more upon the same soil. False promises of employment. By the summer of 1885, life for freed black families in Arkansas was already filled with hardship, yet hope remained their most valuable possession. Into this fragile hope stepped men claiming to be recruiters. They rode into communities near Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and small farming towns, flashing confident smiles and speaking words that sounded trustworthy. They promised steady wages, safe housing, and the opportunity to work on railroad projects or prosperous farms in need of honest labor. For families struggling to sell crops at fair prices or pay off unfair debts, these offers sounded like salvation. The recruiters often carried papers stamped with forged signatures, pretending to represent companies in St. Louis or Memphis. They spoke of opportunities that would allow parents to feed their children and even save enough money to purchase more land. Men and women worn down by poverty believed in the chance for dignity through work. They gathered their few belongings, trusting these promises of a better life. But hidden behind the kind words was a carefully laid trap. The recruiters were not offering jobs, they were agents for landowners who wanted to restore slavery under another name. The families walked willingly into danger, unaware that their freedom would soon vanish. Ambush and capture. The journey that began with hope quickly transformed into terror. As wagons carried men, women, and even children toward supposed new farms, the atmosphere shifted. Outside the towns, far from the eyes of neighbors, the recruiters revealed their true faces. Armed men appeared on horseback, surrounding the travelers. Rifles were pointed at fathers who dared to question what was happening. Iron shackles were pulled from burlap sacks, and chains clanged as wrists and ankles were locked once more. Screams filled the air as mothers tried to shield their children, but resistance was crushed with whips and the threat of bullets. In the forests of rural Arkansas, the nightmare of bondage returned, hidden from the outside world. Those who had once celebrated freedom after the war now stood helpless, bound and broken, realizing the trap had been sprung. Their captors forced them onto wagons, not as workers, but as property. Every mile driven deeper into isolation was another mile away from the dream of independence. Fear settled into their hearts as they understood that the law, the papers, and the promises meant nothing. In that moment, freedom in Arkansas became an illusion, and the shadow of slavery reclaimed its victims. Transport to remote plantations. Following the capture, the families were forced onto rough wooden wagons. The wheels creaked along muddy Arkansas roads, carrying human lives deeper into isolation. The captors chose routes far from towns like Little Rock and Pine Bluff, avoiding places where someone might ask questions. The journey stretched on for days, with only brief stops at riversides where captives received dirty water or scraps of cornbread. Mothers tried to comfort their crying children, whispering lullabies even as their own wrists bled from iron chains. Fathers sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the horizon, powerless to protect their families. The farther the wagons traveled, the more hopeless the situation became. The landscape shifted from open farmlands to thick forests and swamps, natural barriers that trapped the captives in both body and spirit. The overseers laughed, drinking whiskey as they cracked whips in the air, reminding everyone that resistance meant death. Some tried to memorize landmarks, hoping one day to escape. But the isolation of Arkansas's countryside was designed to erase all paths to freedom. Finally, the wagons stopped at hidden plantations, properties owned by men determined to keep slavery alive despite laws declaring it illegal. Here, away from the reach of newspapers or church networks, the captives were unloaded like animals, their names ignored, their dignity stripped away. For them, the journey ended, but the nightmare had only just begun. Life under forced labor. Once on the plantations, the daily rhythm of captivity began with the rising sun. At dawn, the sound of a whip against wood or the shouting of overseers dragged men, women, and children into the fields. Cotton rows stretched endlessly across the land, and the work was backbreaking. Under the hot Arkansas sun, hands became raw and blistered from plucking sharp bolls of cotton. Children as young as 10 carried sacks that weighed nearly as much as their own bodies. Pregnant women were not spared, forced to bend and pull until exhaustion dropped them to the ground. Food was scarce, usually little more than cornmeal, molasses, or beans served at night after hours of labor. Water breaks were limited, and those who slowed down risked a beating. Overseers carried rifles and whips, reminding the captives with every gesture that their lives held no value beyond the work they could perform. Nights brought no rest. Captives slept in shacks made of rotten wood, crowded together on dirt floors. The smell of sweat, blood, and despair filled the air. Yet even in these unbearable conditions, there were signs of resilience. In hushed voices, songs were whispered, prayers were spoken, and elders told stories of freedom to keep hope alive. Every sunrise meant another day of suffering, but also another chance to imagine survival. These plantations, hidden deep within Arkansas, became prisons where slavery was reborn, proving that for many, freedom was still a distant dream. Resistance and secret appeals. Even in the darkness of forced bondage, the human spirit searched for ways to resist. Among the captives on those Arkansas plantations were men and women who remembered stories of the Underground Railroad and churches that had once hidden fugitives. At night, after the overseers drank themselves into sleep, quiet whispers carried from shack to shack. Some spoke of escape, tracing possible routes in the dirt with sticks, memorizing the position of stars, and marking trees with hidden symbols. Mothers hushed their children to avoid drawing suspicion, while fathers promised that freedom was still possible. Messages sometimes reached the outside world through traveling black preachers who visited rural communities under the guise of holding prayer meetings. These preachers, carrying worn Bibles and speaking with strong voices, listened carefully to whispered accounts of captivity. When they left, they carried more than sermons. They carried news of hidden slavery to sympathetic churches in towns like Little Rock or Memphis. Letters were written in secret, hidden beneath clothing or disguised within prayer books, appealing for help from those who still fought for justice. But resistance came at a cost. Anyone caught plotting was beaten savagely, sometimes chained to posts as a warning to others. Still, the seed of defiance could not be destroyed. The captives knew that silence meant death of the soul, while resistance kept hope alive. With every whispered plan and every message carried beyond the plantation, the truth of their suffering in Arkansas slowly began to move toward exposure. Exposure of the crime. The truth of illegal bondage in Arkansas did not remain hidden forever. By the late months of 1885, fragments of testimony reached black newspapers in Memphis, Nashville, and Little Rock. Editors who had long warned of slavery by another name finally had concrete accounts of families captured, chained, and forced into fields. Small articles began to circulate, shocking freed communities who thought such horrors belonged only to the past. Church networks became vital in spreading the word. Ministers preached fiery sermons, calling the abuse a betrayal of God's promise and of the nation's laws. In prayer meetings, names of missing men and women were spoken aloud, their absence a painful reminder that freedom was not yet secure. Women's aid societies began gathering clothes and food for escapees who managed to flee. White authorities, however, dismissed the reports as exaggerations. Local sheriffs, often tied by blood or business to the landowners, denied everything. Yet the noise of truth grew louder. A few brave journalists traveled near the plantations, speaking quietly to those who had escaped and writing stories that described in chilling detail the whips, chains, and endless rows of cotton. These publications spread across the South, stirring outrage among freed people and allies who had fought in the Union Army only 2 decades earlier. Exposure of the crime became more than an article, it became a cry of warning. The world was forced to confront a terrifying fact: slavery had not truly died in Arkansas. It had only changed shape, hiding in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. Confrontation with authorities. As reports of illegal slavery spread, pressure mounted on state officials in Arkansas to act. Black communities in Little Rock and Pine Bluff organized petitions demanding investigations. Church leaders carried testimonies from the countryside directly to the governor's office, insisting that justice could not be delayed. For many freed families, this was a test of whether the law truly protected them or only served the powerful. When authorities finally sent sheriffs to inspect the plantations, the visits were little more than theater. Local lawmen, often friends or business partners of the landowners, claimed they found no evidence of abuse. They described the captives as workers under contract, hiding the truth behind legal words. Families still in chains were instructed to remain silent with guns aimed at them from behind. Fear silenced many, but a few brave voices tried to speak, only to be shouted down. The confrontation reached courtrooms where judges sympathetic to white landowners dismissed testimonies from black witnesses as unreliable. The law, written to appear neutral, was twisted to maintain power. Freed people realized that the system itself was designed to protect those who profited from their labor. Still, the persistence of activists, preachers, and journalists kept the issue alive. Even in the face of lies and cover-ups, the struggle revealed the deep cracks in justice, exposing how fragile freedom remained for black families in Arkansas during 1885. Legacy of fear and memory. Although some captives managed to escape the hidden plantations, many never returned to their communities. Families were torn apart once again, with mothers left to wonder if their sons or husbands still lived somewhere in bondage. The memory of betrayal ran deep, carried in stories whispered from generation to generation. In Arkansas, freedom came to mean survival rather than true independence. Communities that once gathered with songs and hope now carried silence and caution. Parents taught their children never to trust strangers offering work, warning that behind a friendly voice could hide chains. The scars of 1885 remained, both physical and emotional. Even decades later, elders recalled the sound of wagon wheels rolling into the forest, taking loved ones away forever. Yet these painful memories also built resilience. Churches became stronger centers of protection. Schools taught children about dignity and vigilance, and newspapers continued to expose injustice. The story of the freed community recaptured and forced back into bondage became part of a larger truth, that slavery had not ended cleanly with the Civil War, but had lingered in shadows, taking new forms. This legacy shaped the identity of black families in Arkansas and beyond. Their suffering was not forgotten. It was transformed into a lesson of survival, courage, and the unbreakable will to fight for real freedom. The echoes of 1885 remind us that liberty, once stolen, must be guarded fiercely. For history has shown how quickly it can be taken away.